Hi everyone, we wanted to talk to you today about clean language questions. They are questions essentially that are free of bias, they are objective, and they're really useful when you're wanting to work with a metaphor that somebody might use. So, an example of that might be she's a shining star, or I feel like I'm hitting my head against a brick wall, or that type of thing. It's also really useful with emotions. So if you want to be able to explore somebody's emotion, whether that's anger, frustration, sadness, joy, all the full range of emotions, they can be really useful. So just to set this in context, clean language is a communications methodology that was developed by David Grove, who was a New Zealand-based counselling psychologist, and he developed this during the 1980s and the 1990s. And it helps people to really convey their own meaning, free of distraction or interpretation by their manager or by the coach themselves. So you're working with what they say and what they say only. So if we take a look at some examples, there are 3 different groupings of clean language questions, and there are 12 questions in total in terms of basic clean language questions. So there are 6 what we call developing questions. So if somebody says, I keep hitting my head against a brick wall, you could work with that and ask them, what kind of wall is that?
And you might, if you haven't heard of clean language before, what you'll notice is these are not questions that you'd be asked on a day-to-day basis. They aren't the sorts of conversations that you might have over coffee or with a friend. And so this is where you can really dig into your skill as a coach to bring something new to your clients that that will ultimately shift their perspective, because they just haven't had opportunity to think about their topic in this way before. And this isn't an end-to-end kind of coaching script. This is just something that you would work with. So as Joe said, so what kind of brick wall is that? And they'll have to go inside of themselves to think, well, is it really big? Is it really small? Is it really wide? Is it really narrow? And they'll be able to describe the shape of that brick wall. And that's important because it helps them to actually connect with what might be a problem for them. So they might think, actually, a brick wall's really small. I didn't notice it was really small. I could step over it. Or, yeah, this is a really big brick wall. It's really solid. It really hurts when I bang my head against it. And it gives them, again, a connection to the topic that they're talking about.
Yeah, and so if you're working with somebody's emotion, you would ask the same question, but instead it would sound like, what kind of frustration is that? And the person might say, it's really heavy, or it's really grey, or it's really noisy. It doesn't matter what they say, it matters to them. But our job when we're coaching is to be able to facilitate the person to go somewhere new in their thinking. So they've been asking themselves lots of questions about their situation, and they haven't yet identified or motivated themselves to a solution. So our job is to be able to ask different types of questions that they haven't asked themselves before.
Yeah.
And so the next question is just a follow on from that, really, where the very famous coaching question is, what else? In this format it is, and is there anything else about the wall, or is there anything else about the frustration? So we're not adding anything of our own stuff into it. We're just walking side by side with the individual.
Yeah, and again, this is just about expanding their thinking and helping them to go beyond some of the thinking they may have already been able to do on their own. So then you'd follow up. Sorry, Joe. Yeah.
Sorry. They might say, for example, when you ask them, and is there anything else about the wall? They might say, oh, I noticed that the mortar's crumbling in places. And then, you can think, okay, and what does that tell us about the situation? Or if it was frustration, and he said, is there anything else about the frustration? They might say, oh, yeah, it's close friends with anger. So you haven't asked them about that. You haven't given them any other words. It's coming from them. So it's really great for building self-awareness as well as being able to identify options.
Yeah. So then we've got, and where is maybe the brick wall, the anger, the frustration? And again, this is about them being able to connect with their mind and their body. What we're finding at the moment, particularly working with people, is people are strung out. It's been quite a challenging time. So being able to connect people back inside of their body, to be able to say, yeah, it might be around them, it might be inside of them, it might be overwhelming them. It's just a chance for them to think about how they're feeling, but not necessarily having to experience it in order to feel it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so if somebody was talking about two kind of competing things or things that were in conflict, for example, the fifth question is, and is there a relationship between this and this? So is there a relationship between the frustration that you mentioned and the anger that you mentioned? Or is there a relationship between you and the brick wall? And then the sixth question, so the other developing question is, and when one thing happens, what happens to the other thing? So is it further exploring that relationship? So when frustration is there, what happens to the anger?
Yeah. Or you might have a context, where they were saying, oh, I'm just hitting my head against a brick wall. And that might have been in the context of having a conversation with a line manager or a colleague. You might say, and when you're with your colleague, what happens to the brick wall? Or when you're at the brick wall, what happens to you? You can just play. It doesn't actually matter. Again, it's just about extending that awareness.
You're really kind of meeting the client where the client's at, and you're exploring their world with them, which is, a core coaching competency. So then there are three, what we call sequence and source questions. So it's about finding out what happens next. It's pursuing that. So you're going to ask them, and then what happens? And then what happens after that? So if it's frustration, when the frustration happens, what happens next? Yeah. Or when you hit your head against that brick wall, what happens next? And then you're going to take them back in time. So, and what happens just before the frustration? What happens just before you hit your head against that brick wall?
And then, that's just a real point of insight for the client, because at this point they're just in their problem. They're in the frustration, they're hitting their head against a brick wall, they're experiencing that. Very rare do people go, actually, yeah, what happens just before? It helps you to identify your triggers. It helps you to be in the space between when one thing happens and the next thing happens, and just to explore that piece in the middle.
Because sometimes people will say, I just feel frustrated all the time. Mm-hmm. And actually, when you ask them and what comes just before it, it almost just creates that space so they realise, actually, I don't feel frustrated all of the time. It felt that way, but now I'm thinking about it. Just before I get frustrated, it's usually when I'm confused. So I get confused before the frustration. So then, as you're saying, it's like, okay, so what's the trigger? What are the situations where you get confused? And so it's making sure that when somebody decides on what they want to do, that it's related to the root cause and not the symptom.
Yeah. So where are we now? What happens just before? And then we've got, well, where could X come from? So where could the frustration come from? Where could the anger come from? Where does the banging your head against a brick wall come from? Or if you've just talked about this kind of space in between where it says perhaps it's confusion that makes you bang your head against a brick wall, you might say, well, where does the confusion come from? So again, you're just using the client's language, the insight that you've gathered, to pose them yet another question to help them to explore their topic.
Yeah. And then the final three questions are intention questions. So we've got what would the frustration like to have happen? Mm-hmm. Which I just think is a brilliant, brilliant question, because it's so abstract, but is wonderful. And if it was in the context, if we follow through the examples we've been using, so the brick wall, what would the brick wall like to have happen?
Or your head.
Yeah.
What would your head like to have happen?
Yeah. And then what needs to happen for frustration? Mm-hmm. There's like a follow-up to that, and to check that we've exhausted what's possible there.
Yeah.
And then the final question, which is,
and can that happen? Can frustration get that, or is there a way for you to make that happen? And you would then probably carry on a conversation about that. So after you've kind of used these clean questions, and identified perhaps that, frustration is as a result of confusion, and actually what you'd like instead is to develop clarity, you might then continue on your conversation using something like the GROW model to talk about, okay, so how can you get that clarity? When we introduce these to trainee coaches, what they tend to say is like, well, they're really weird questions. Like, I don't want to use those. I
myself asking those.
Yeah, no chance. Like, someone's going to think that I'm nuts. Do you know what? Learning to be a coach, learning coaching skills, it's just about play, and it's about experiencing something as well. So I would encourage you to just try these out. We use metaphor in day-to-day conversation. So if you're chatting with a friend and someone says to you, oh, I just feel so heavy, just try asking something like, well, what kind of heaviness is that? Just see what they say, because actually, whilst they sound like odd questions, they are really powerful.
It's playful, it's very powerful, playful way. So you might think about whether you need to ask permission to ask these types of questions before you do it, if that enables you to feel safe. I mean, the feedback from, when our trainees practice with these questions is they absolutely love it from the perspective of being the coachee. Like, it's so powerful. It didn't sound weird when I was asked those questions. But it was really, really helpful. And when they're practicing in the role of coach, obviously with new things, there's always that feeling a bit stilted, but there's also that recognition of, where they need to move out of their comfort zone into the stretch to really add value in the conversation in that role of coach. So it's not something that you need to use all the time, but it's a really useful toolbox of questions to be able to draw on when you're working with metaphor or emotion, for example, like we've taken you through today. So, enjoy the play.
Yeah.